What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and whatever time it is. Welcome back to another video with you, man, Measureaholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another faction/campaign overview for Total War Rune 2 using the Divide et Impera overhaul mod. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are focusing on the Getae. The Getae faction is basically what is consisting of Dacian tribes, so I'll be referring to the Dacians and the Getae a fair bit, but I'll try to focus on just saying Getae. But anyway, we're going to be focusing on this faction today. It's a very small faction. It's one of the more underrated ones in my opinion. You're not going to see as many Let's Plays or videos focusing on it. I believe it's one of those more underrated factions that people might kind of try once, but I don't know if they lose interest or perhaps they just don't know enough about the people to be overly interested. But hopefully this video today will change your mind and get you playing them, because I think they're a really cool faction, and I'm going to tell you why here in just a second. So anyway, before we jump into the campaign itself, let's look at the basic benefits and disadvantages that the Getae receive, and then we'll jump on in. So anyway, beginning at the top here, distinct peoples +2 public order from Daco or Daco, Thracian and Illyrian culture. So basically you'll have a little bit of extra public order for settlements that have a high amount of the following cultures, which the Daco Thracian or Dacio Thracian, I'm not sure how you would pronounce it. I guess it would be Daco, which is not what I was expecting, but anyway, basically, if you take over a settlement that is in the Dacian region or in the Thracian region, you'll have a little bit of a small bonus to the public order there. However, this is actually a very significant bonus that you get. Minus 50% building conversion costs. So what does that actually mean? It means when you take over a faction that doesn't have the same culture as you, you need to convert their buildings to your culture, so that way you can begin getting the full benefits of them. And the Getae receive a 50% buff, or I should say decrease really, in the amount of money it costs to convert these buildings, which is actually really useful, because one, you're going to be dealing with a lot of factions that do not share your culture, and two, they can be very expensive, and that's going to be a really bad thing for you to deal with playing as the Getae, because their economy for the most part is pretty rough, but we'll be getting into the details of that soon enough. Moving down here towards the bottom, you have the defensive networks bonus. You receive special fortification buildings. This I cannot comment on all that much. I've looked into it, and from what I've seen, you basically get a special chain of buildings that increases your garrison troops, like your number of garrison units in a region, in addition to giving it certain bonuses. But I'll show you that once we jump in the campaign. So to me, it's not really all that special. It's not really going to make or break a garrison, but I might be wrong. But that is the first time I've seen a perk like this. So it's interesting though that the DEI team is at least trying to throw in some really cool variety in the bonuses that some of these factions can get. You also get increased melee infantry damage. That's always welcome. I'm not sure on the exact percentage of this. Again, I wish those kind of things were shown. I could probably find it out if I jumped into the files of the game, but nobody got time for that. But yeah, more melee damage is always welcome. It could be a better bonus, to be honest, but it's not bad. This right here, though, your diplomatic penalty against Rome, it doesn't necessarily matter all that much. You're almost certainly going to fight Rome regardless of what you do. You could have probably bought their friendship for a little while, but eventually Rome fights pretty much everybody. You gotta really throw a lot of money at them to stop them from coming at you. So playing as a Getae, you're gonna be facing Rome almost regardless of what you do. You're gonna have to be quite lucky to have Rome be friendly with you. But anyway, that's it for the bonuses. Let's jump on into the campaign map and get started on part 1 of our campaign overview for the Getae. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the campaign map for the Getae. This is going to be fairly quick since we are just a single settlement faction, and there isn't really all that too much to discuss, at least not in this part. Part 2, where we cover the units and the battles of the Getae, that will take definitely a lot longer. But anyway, I want to start off by pointing out two things. Firstly, you have two major decisions to make when you're playing as a faction like this. And what I mean by a faction like this is that the Getae can convert buildings very quickly, or not very quickly I should say, but fairly cheaply. So say if you were up here and you went down to, like, say Athens, and you converted their buildings, it wouldn't cost anywhere near as much as it normally would. So that's very useful for a faction that can migrate. Like I said, you have two decisions to make. One, you can migrate instantly, go wherever it is you want to go on the map. I would personally recommend probably going towards either Gaul in the west if you want a really long trek, way out here. Or if you want a shorter trek, I would recommend you go northeast towards the Bosporan Kingdom. The why is fairly simple for that decision, but anyway, before I expand on that, let me finish part 2 of this dilemma. You can either migrate, or you can basically sit on your ass and consolidate and stay in your homeland. That's always the main thing that most people do with factions, especially a faction that might seem to be very difficult. For example, I believe the Getae are definitely within the top 5 factions of difficulty in Divided Impera. I don't believe the normal difficulty level they've been assigned is accurate. Might just be because I'm not that great of a player with them, I don't know. But that's just my opinion on them, which is all these videos are, really, is my opinion on these factions. But I'll give you some reasoning behind that as we move forward. But getting back to the migrating, if you go west into Gaul, you'll be going up against very heavily spear-orientated nations. If you go into northern Gaul, into Belgium, and you begin fighting Germans as well, then you'll have a problem. But if you go into Gaul proper, especially on the southern edge, or maybe even on the southwestern edge near Bertigala, maybe down near Massalia. Massalia might be a bit too far south, but anyway, if you're anywhere over here, you could be fighting armies that are very dependent on spears, and that is something that your faction can handle very well. So I will recommend that, or you migrate east towards the Bosporan Kingdom. Once you knock out that Hellenic faction, you'll be surrounded by nomadic factions, but these nomadic factions rely almost entirely on cavalry. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's going to be hard to deal with because they'll be just running away from your units. Yes, this is true if it were controlled by a player. However, the AI cannot handle skirmishing and kiting tactics too well. It's not terrible, and you're definitely going to struggle if you don't play your cards right, but facing full horse armies as a spear and hoplite heavy faction is quite good. But we'll get into the units a little bit later on. But just do keep in mind the Getae are fairly spear reliant, especially in the early game, but I'll explain that later. Moving forward though, let's assume that you want to stay here and you don't want to migrate initially. Getting to our diplomacy, most of your neighbors are pretty much dead neutral. You do have the Skodiski to your west here who are hostile, and then you have the Apulii to the northwest here who are actually fairly friendly with you, and you can easily get a friendship going with them. However, you might not want to, because if we get out of the diplomacy, you'll see they hold the capital city of the province that you're in, and you're going to want that capital city if you're staying in Dacia. So that's up to you how you want to play your cards with them. Maybe you start off friendly, screw them over later on, especially once you deal with your southern neighbors. But yeah, diplomatically, you start off neutral. However, since you are so small and weak, if you don't recruit a decent sized army quickly, your other neighbors will begin declaring war on you, especially the Daci over here, the Bastanos possibly, although they do get tied up in their other wars. Thracians definitely, especially in the mid games, they get quite powerful then. So don't let the neutrality fool you. You will have wars to deal with early on. In fact, in some of my test campaigns, the Desi declare war on me usually within the first 10 turns, unless I try to buy their friendship, which you can. But keep that in mind. Neutrality does not necessarily mean they are friendly to you, and it can come back and bite you in the butt if you're not careful. So that is your diplomacy. Very basic initially. However, the basic diplomacy that you start off with gets complicated quite a little bit further as we look at the cultures of the nations surrounding you. Now here you have some Daco-Thracians, and then down here is some more Daco-Thracians. So you have some cousins nearby. You can even confederate with them if you can try. Good luck with that. I've never seen the AI do that with me, at least not in DEI, for a very, very long time. But if you can, that'd be great. However, the main issue that you'll be dealing with diplomatically and also militarily is that there are a lot of different factions around you. The Bastanos are Celts. The Skodiski are Celts. You have the Adricians down here who are Daco-Thracian technically, but they have a lot more Thracian-based troops in that they have very heavy shock units that will decimate your spearmen. So don't let the Daco-Thracian fool you with them. They are your cousins, but perhaps a little bit more distant than your other neighbors over here, like Daci and Apulii. Down here at the Tolisto Bogii, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correct, they are also Celts. So you're surrounded by a lot of Celts and cousins of yours who are also Dacian and Thracian. However, these are all fairly small nations. They're pretty much all entirely one settlement factions. Once you beat them, you have even more cultures to deal with. Down here you have the Greeks. Over here you have the nomadic factions. And then even once you beat the nomadic factions, you have the Armenians and the other nations of the Caucasus over there. Furthermore, if you go west, you have obviously Rome to deal with, which you have a diplomatic penalty against. So you're going to be going to war with them if they come out here very quickly. Up here to your northwest, you have Germans that will be coming down. Basically, despite you being in a fairly quiet section of the map, or at least what would be perceived as fairly quiet and fairly remote, you're actually in the middle of a multicultural melting pot, and that can really come back to bite you in your diplomacy and in your military and basically overall campaign. Dealing with other cultures can make things very tricky, and it can make them hard to deal with diplomatically and, like I said, militarily as well, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So keep that in mind. Your diplomacy looks simple, but you do have more complications. There are more layers that you need to be attentive to. Moving on, however, looking down here in the bottom right corner, your economy is terrible. You have 1,800 income, you don't even have an army yet, and you only have 21,000 in your treasury to start. And you have this tiny little backward village of Malva. You can expand your settlement right away, but you can't expand it twice. So whatever building you want, choose very wisely. I would recommend you choose the Warriors Lodge and get down the path of getting better infantry to back up your armies very quickly. But regardless, money is going to be a big problem for you for the early game, and to be honest, for the majority of the game you're going to struggle with income until the late game. Once you have massive trade networks happening, and once you have that happening, you're pretty much fine anyway by that point. But trade is going to be quite hard for you. You are a landlocked nation initially. You can change that pretty quickly. You do have some coastal settlements over here in the east, but even then you don't have a lot to offer. You have some grain here, like who cares, you know what I mean? A lot of these factions aren't really going to be all that willing to trade with you if you're of a different culture and you don't have all that much to offer to them. So trade is not going to be a big part of your economy ever unless you really, really try hard to make it. You'll be focusing on agriculture and trying to use resources to your benefit, such as mines and whatnot, such as iron ore to your south, or I believe there's some diamond cities up here to the northwest, but that's quite far away. So basically your economy is pretty bad. You're going to be relying on agriculture for the majority of your campaign, So try to focus on those buildings that will grant you the money that you need to keep things going, and you could need it very, very desperately. It's like I said, it's going to be a real struggle. You do have a lot of different options here, though. And we can actually build a goldsmithy, which is very interesting considering you don't even have gold. I wonder why that is. But regardless, agriculture is where your money is going to be, so focus on dealing with that as much as you can. Moving forward, though, to my next point, if you make it to the late game, you have a very real chance of getting double teamed by Rome down here to your southwest, and then one of the Hellenic factions to your southeast. There's a very high chance it will be the Seleucids. If not, then possibly Macedon if they end up overrunning the other city-states. But basically, in your late game, you're going to be dealing with Rome 100% certain every single time. Every day of the week, you're going to be fighting Rome in the late game. And as the Dacians, that is going to be very tricky. Not as impossible as it may seem, but it is going to be very, very hard still regardless. I'll get into the details of that shortly once we get into the military side of things. But do keep in mind, your late game will consist of consolidating the Dacian and Germanic forest to your north and fighting Romans and the Hellenic factions to your west and south. Moving on to my final campaign point, though, the population is actually going to be a pretty solid struggle for you throughout the campaign, or at least for the early game. Maybe not towards the late game, but at the very least for the early campaign. Now, you might be thinking, well, why is that? We're a barbarian faction, right? We should be able to just recruit troops from wherever. That's just not the case. A lot of your units are going to be coming from what is called the warrior class. You can see here your home city of Malva has only 3,000 men that you can recruit from the warrior class. Now that sounds like a decent amount, but it's not when your best units are coming from there. Your warriors here, 200 manpower is required for this unit, right? If I get 5 of those units, there's 1,000 of our population gone, and they're not going to be quickly replaced either. And that's just getting 5 axemen. The same is to be said for some of your mercenaries here. Your cavalry that you can recruit, some foxmen that you are almost certainly going to want in your armies. They're going to be coming from the warrior class and not foreigners. At least not here. As you move out, then that will change, I believe. But initially, your warrior class is actually quite limited. And so you're basically going to be relying on these levy-style spearmen units and the levy-style skirmishers to supplement your armies and to give basically your better warrior units time to kill the enemy by outflanking them. But yeah, just do keep that in mind. Population is definitely going to be a struggle in the early game. Perhaps not in the mid to late game, but I mean, it's always going to be something that you need to consider when you're looking to recruit new armies. And when you're looking to launch an invasion, you're always going to lose soldiers. So think about where you're going to replace those soldiers. Are you going to get them from a new city you take over? Or are you going to have to move back? Or are you going to have to replace your Dacian troops with mercenaries or whatever? Keep that in mind. You don't have a lot of population available. But anyway, let's move on to part 2 of this video where we talk about the army and the military of the Getae. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with the military of the Getae. Starting from the top, we have some spear-orientated generals. That should give you a very large hint about your army moving forward. Let's go to unit info here. They're basically hoplites. This unit is technically more of a spearman unit, but they do act as a sort of heavy spearman slash kind of a hoplite unit. So that's the only infantry available to your general's bodyguards throughout the entire campaign. That's it. So keep that in mind. Beyond that, though, you have some very good cavalry that is available as your personal bodyguards. When they're available to you, you're probably going to want to use these the most. They will be expensive to maintain and recruit, though. especially when compared to like the hoplite unit here. 1200 comparing to 2100. That's a massive difference in cost for a general's bodyguard unit, and not all generals have to be warriors. Keep that in mind. Even if you're playing a quote-unquote barbarian faction, not all of your generals have to be warriors, so it might be worth saving the money here so you can get more of your better units down the line. But anyway, your personal bodyguard cavalry that is available is really telling to your faction in that you're going to be very reliant on spearmen and cavalry, especially shock cavalry, that also doubles as skirmisher cavalry, which is very rare and very cool, but we'll get into that a little bit later. First, we're going to move down the list to melee infantry early on. Melee infantry is a very kind of mixed bag with the Getae. First off, your troops are never going to be well armored. The highest armor you get with your infantry is, I believe, 38, and that's with an elite spearman unit down here. So up here with your melee units, you're getting the 35, and that is with a reformed unit that you're not going to get until the late game. That's really rough. Armor is not a strong suit for your faction. You're going to suffer against enemy projectiles, especially against enemy javelins in particular. Your large shields will help you against slingers, but it depends on the angle slingers are firing at, so keep that in mind. But getting to these units themselves, you're going to be relying on your axemen and your folksmen to do a lot of the armor piercing damage towards the enemy units, because you don't really have any swordsmen at all. The only swordsman unit you get is this unit here. It is expensive and it is a late game unit. You only get this after you receive your reforms, and your reforms absolutely suck. You have to wait 100 turns to receive your reforms, and in addition you also have to have fought 10 battles against Rome of all people. So basically this is the Getae's answer to the Roman legionnaire, or to the Roman style of fighting. So you're not going to get this unit until quite a while into the campaign, and it might not even be worth going to war with Rome just to get it, to be honest. It's not even that great of a swordsman unit. Your attack is quite good, defense is decent, charge pretty basic, your weapon damage is actually quite high. However, you have no armor penetration, don't really have any bonus against infantry or cavalry, nor elephants. You have 1 javelin, so that's okay, but your armor is only at 35. Not terrible, but it's not like, hey, quick, I need to rush and get this unit very quickly, because instead what you're going to be doing is using your spearman units and your phalanx units to help support these other units you have up here. Now you do have these lower tier folksman units. Wait, no. Yeah. I mean your lower tier, what they call Sika units, which is basically using like a smaller version of the folks. They don't really have the armor penetration that your proper folksmen do, nor your axemen, so I wouldn't really be relying on them too much, especially considering their morale is pretty poor for the most part. But then your basic axemen that you start off with have very poor morale as well, so be careful of that. But basically, you don't have swordsmen that are really worth mentioning besides this one unit. You're going to be relying on your unique folksmen to do a lot of your killing for you, in addition to your very cheap axemen. That's basically it for when it comes to your infantry. They're not going to be killers across the entire line like Roman units are, for example. Romans, you present a line of legionnaires, you expect them to get a lot of kills. Here, that's not going to be the case whatsoever. Your axemen and your folksmen are not going to make the bulk of your armies. What is going to be the bulk of your army is your spearmen and your phalanx infantry. The Getae are a little bit of a different barbarian style faction in that they have access to spearmen units that basically act as hoplites, and even then you have explicit units stating they are hoplites. You even have heavy hoplites that have decent armor and a decent shield as well. In fact, an excellent shield. So I'm going to be combining these two categories together. Your spearmen units here they will do when you don't have the phalanx infantry to hold the line, but you're pretty much always going to have phalanx infantry available to hold the line. So these are more so supporting troops for your cavalry and your flanks in general. For the majority of your armies, at least in the early to mid game, they're going to be consisting of Getae hoplites and these chosen spearmen. Heavy hoplites would be nice, but they are expensive and you have to build. You have to spend a lot of time building on your military buildings to get them. So you're not going to be getting them too quickly, but if you rush, you can get them early on if you like. I don't think it's all that necessary to rush. Your basic hoplites down here will do what they need to do, which is defend. They have a very high defense of 17, which is quite good. The morale is pretty decent. Armor is okay, nothing to prance around about, but nothing to scoff at either. They will survive against, for example, slingers for quite a while. Archers and javelin men, though, will be another story, just like it is for all of your units, though, so we can't say too much about that. But in my opinion, the Getae will shine the most when you're using these phalanx troops in conjunction with units like your axemen, your folksmen, your seeker bearers and whatnot. Your swordsmen as well will also be quite good at flanking the enemy, although they don't have the armor penetration, so they won't really be all that good against Romans. Keep that in mind about your one swordsman unit. But that is where your phalanx and spear and swordsman slash folks units come into play. These are your line infantry, these are your cavalry supporting infantry, and these are units that you're going to be using to kill the enemy in flanking, in a flanking maneuver. However, the Getae actually have pretty good archers, which is very interesting. They start off with some basic bowmen, nothing crazy. Start off with some decent skirmishers, for the most part pretty basic. The morale is quite low, so be careful of that. They're not really going to do well in a fight whatsoever, so they're not going to be good at flanking, although they will do a morale penalty against the enemy. I think you have basic slingers. Your slinger game is very weak, as is your skirmishing capabilities with infantry, but not necessarily with cavalry, but we'll get to that in a moment. But then you have 3 more units of archers that you get to choose from, and they increase in their skill as you keep going, but also they increase in armor, which is a very big difference. Right here, this unit has no armor whatsoever, but then you go to the next one and it jumps up to 35. That's pretty crazy for a archer unit to have. That means that they're going to do very well against enemy slingers and enemy archers. They have a shield on their back, I believe, but it's not really going to help them all that much. But they have a good range on them. They have some decent ammunition, and they actually have some pretty good melee attack. So once you use them to kill the enemy skirmishers or cavalry or whatever, you can actually use these troops to rear charge the enemy. Now, I wouldn't recommend it since their defense is pretty pathetic. They're going to die in a head-on collision of any kind pretty quickly. However, a melee attack of 9, while it's not very good, it's good for an archer unit. So they are going to be useful in more ways than one, and they have their armor to back them up. So keep that in mind. They're actually a very good unit. And then we move on to the Hectic Elite archers, which are very expensive. They do have very good range, though, very good damage at 18, the same as a Cretan archer. Their melee attack is insanely high at 13, which is very, very good for an archer unit. Defense is at 4, though. Charge bonus is at 19, pretty shit. Armor penetration, non-existent. Their armor is again at 35, though, so again, you can use these troops to flank enemy formations, and they will actually do fairly decent against unarmored opponents. So keep that in mind. They're good for more things than one. We're moving down to our shock cavalry, although pretty much all of our cavalry can be considered shock cavalry nearly. This unit is fairly basic. It has an armor of 38, so it's actually fairly good. Beyond that, though, these are basically units that you're going to be using to chase down enemy skirmisher cavalry and enemy skirmishers in general. Nothing too great, but nothing too bad at all. So they're just your solid, basically, the Roman equites for the Getae style. They're a decent cavalry, and they will do what they need to do, which is get involved in melee engagements and chase down enemy cavalry when needed. However, Moving on, we have some very light scout riders here. They will be fulfilling a very similar role to this unit of cavalry. However, this unit of cav will be doing much better on the charge. This unit isn't terrible on the charge, but it's not going to be doing amazing. And they are very lightly armored, whereas at least this unit up here has some very good armor for a cav unit at 38. And these are javelin men as well. So you're going to be mainly using these to chase light skirmishers or harass enemy formations. You're not really going to be wanting them to engage in a melee fight, but they can do rear charges if you like. Moving forward though, we have some more skirmisher units here. They're going to be fulfilling a very similar role. They are just better all around though. They have higher penetration, higher morale. They also don't really have armor like this unit here does, so that's going to be a problem. But their attack is better, defense is the same, and the charge is actually slightly weaker, so these units are going to be fulfilling basically the same role as this unit, but they'll be doing it slightly better pretty much across the board. So it's basically an upgrade for your troops, so that's not bad. But then we move on to your shock cavalry, which is funny because it says Getae heavy horse archers. They're not just heavy horse archers, they are heavy, basically cataphract units. You're getting to a serious charge bonus of 56. That is pretty friggin' fantastic for a unit that is also an archer. That's quite incredible. And it's kind of the Getae's secret weapon. You wouldn't really expect a unit like a faction like this, I should say, that has such good shock cavalry, especially when it's surrounded by nations that don't have good shock cav, like the Celts and the Germans to your north. However, you can use that against them, and that's kind of going to be your secret weapon against a more heavily armored or at least more numerous formations, especially against the swordsmen. They're going to be very helpful in killing the enemy swordsman units when they're coming at you. And then we just have proper Dacian cataphracts. They're also an archer unit, which is pretty awesome. Use and abuse that as much as you can. Their attack is high, however, like this unit of cavalry here, they have pretty low defense, and in fact they have way lower defense than what the other unit does. So either do your damage at range or charge in, get some kills and get the hell out. Don't stick into melee fights for long with these units. You're going to get the most bang for your buck with constant cycling of charges, and let your units rest, by the way. Resting your troops can really help make or break a battle. With your cavalry in particular, so especially when they're so heavily armored. 49 armor, that's pretty insane. They're gonna tire out fairly quickly if you're not too careful, so do be careful. And then our last final point is the siege equipment options for the Getae are pretty basic and not very good. You can get a scorpion, a very basic scorpion, or you can get a ballista. That's kind of it. You don't have many options, and even then they are just like the bare minimum in siege equipment. For the most part, I probably wouldn't even use these pieces of field artillery, to be honest. I would focus on my earlier suggestion, which is having phalanx infantry hold the line, folks, axe, seeker troops, whatever you want to use. Get in behind the enemy, get your kills, especially your armor piercing units such as your axemen with armor penetration at 12. Use that to get behind Roman units in particular, as well as Greek heavy hoplites and whatnot. They're going to do a lot of the killing for you, as will your cavalry down here, your shock cav, when you can afford them. They are very expensive, so perhaps try to pair your surrounding infantry with some archers and try to focus fire on targets of opportunity when necessary. But that's basically it. The Getae have a fairly interesting roster in that they have very good cavalry, and they have some very unique cavalry as well. However, they have almost no swordsmen to speak of, and even then, the melee basic infantry that they do have, they are a very mixed bag. They pretty much all have low armor. They're not going to do very well in head-on collisions. These are flanking troops. You're going to be relying on phalanx infantry, which is very interesting and kind of rare for barbarian factions. But it's also very cool. I really like their armies, and their units look fantastic on the battlefield, so I highly recommend you check them out. But anyway, now that we're done with part 2, actually no, we're not done with part 2 because I have one last thing to say. Naval battles, just don't do them. Your navy is terrible, like the majority of barbarian factions, or at least a large chunk of them. Your ships suck, you don't have variety, don't fight on the ocean. That's basically the bottom line, or if you do, use mercenary ships if you can. But yeah, that's pretty much it, just don't do it. Your navy sucks, it's one of the worst in the game, but I imagine many of the other barbarian factions will be similar to this roster. So stay away from them. Anyway, now let's move on to part 3 to get the final verdict on the Getae for the Grand Campaign for DEI. Okay, so a few final points before I give you guys my overall thoughts on the difficulty level and close out this faction overview. Firstly, Rome is going to be a major issue for you in the late game if you can survive to the late game. You start off in a very precarious position. You have a lot of enemy cultures around you, or perhaps not enemy cultures, but you have a lot of cultures, and when you go to war against one of them, you'll end up angering the others around you. So you are in a very precarious position. You really need to time your invasions correctly, so when your enemies are distracted, as well as your neighbors. Try to build friendships with factions that are actually going to hold up to their friendships. You do have some treacherous nations around you, so keep that in mind. And you're really going to struggle when you're fighting certain cultures, such as the Romans with their very heavy infantry and their AOR units that will help them make up for the areas that they lack in. You'll also struggle against the Celts and the Germans, and if you end up fighting them, some of the Hellenic units, mainly the more larger ones from the Diadochi factions, such as the Egyptians and the Seleucids, their pikemen will just trash your hoplites any day of the week, so be very aware of that when you march east. But when you're marching west against the Celts, Germans, and the Romans, they all have better swordsmen than you. They have a lot of swordsmen, and the Germans in particular also have quite a few shock units that can scare your units and do some very good damage against spearmen that you'll be relying on. They have some very good axemen and basically just very good shock cavalry, not shock cavalry, shock infantry all around. So be careful with the Germans. They will be hard for you to deal with if you don't balance your army correctly against them. The Celts are more reliant on swordsmen, although they will have 1 or 2 axemen units, but their swords will cut through your spearmen as well, just as the Roman swordsmen will as well. So really, you're starting in a very rough position, and it's going to be rough throughout the entire campaign, because once you beat one certain culture, once you beat the Celts for example, you're going to be fighting Illyrians and Romans who are just behind them to the west, and it just continues in like a donut of doom as you continue expanding outwards. So do keep that in mind. Migrating really might help you out with this campaign. Again, I recommend you either go west or you go east towards the Bosporan Kingdom and deal with the nomadic factions out there. If you do want to try migrating, which I recommend you do try at least at some point. Maybe don't make it one of your more serious campaigns, it's up to you, but I do and I love it. It's a really interesting thing to do, especially in DEI. Moving on though, keep in mind you are one of the harder factions when it comes to having a stable economy. Thankfully, a lot of your troops are fairly cheap, but your better troops that you're going to rely on to defeat the enemy factions that are really good, such as Rome and the Hellenic factions to your southeast, you're going to need your elites, or you're going to need a crap ton of your cheap units to overrun them, and both ways are going to require you to have a good amount of money. So your economy is going to be a constant struggle. You're really going to have to build up your cities that you do take over. Maybe consider raiding enemy cities nearby, perhaps just looting them, letting them rebel, and then taking them over and making a client state that might help you, depending on how well you fight your battles. Which leads me into my second last point. Population can and probably will be an issue for at least the early to mid part of your campaign. Your decent units that are just basic axemen and folksmen rely on the warrior class, so make sure you're monitoring your warrior class population in all of your cities. Make sure it's increasing as quickly as possible. and you have as many available as you can, especially if you're playing an invasion. Make sure you have reserves to replenish the troops that you lose, because you will lose troops. Doesn't matter how good you are, when you're playing as a faction like this that has such little armor, you're going to lose troops no matter what. So keep that in mind. And then the last point is that you're going to be relying on flanking to win battles. Now I know that's how the majority of battles go. You have your lines meet in the center of the battlefield, and then you basically fight to control the flanks. Well, both armies fight to control the flanks, and then whoever wins the flanks wins the battle, usually. With the Getae though, that's basically the only way you're going to win a battle. You won't be able to have enough units to charge head on into the enemy with your axemen and folksmen, I should say. Very largely due to the fact that your population is struggling at the beginning of the game. If you create an entire army out of axemen and folksmen, you can do that, but you have almost literally no one to replace them when they start dying. So I really would recommend against it. But this also means that sieges are going to be really tough for you. You're going to struggle to take some of the larger cities, perhaps not the smaller villages where you can outflank the enemy pretty easily, but the cities, you're really going to have to get creative in outflanking the enemy down the streets, and you're going to have to rely possibly on mercenary units to take the brunt of the enemy archer fire and skirmisher fire before you get your troops inside the walls, because again, the majority of your units are not well armored, although they do have large shields which will help them against taking and absorbing slinger fire. But anyway, that's almost it for part 3 of the verdict, but I am going to give you guys a rating out of 10 on this. I thought about this for quite a while. It might be slightly too high. I need to play more campaigns as the Getae to really get a proper accurate number for this, but in my opinion for now, I'm awarding them a 7 out of 10. In my opinion, they are a hard faction to play. Anything above a 7 is a very hard faction to play in my opinion, but a 7 is just a solid, hard faction to play. You start off in a difficult position, you have a lot of different issues to deal with, and you're going to be dealing with those issues throughout the entire campaign for the most part. It's not like, for example, Carthage, where if you knock out one faction, such as Rome, when you're playing as Carthage, then you have the whole campaign. That's never going to be the case for the Getae. I mean, if you could defeat Rome, then sure, the Getae are going to do really, really well. That's what could be said for any faction on the map whatsoever. The Getae are going to be struggling against Hellenic factions. They're going to be struggling against Germans in the north, Celts all around you. The nomads to your east might give you a run for your money, although I feel like you will outclass them since you have the spearmen to back up your troops and you have good archers to kill their cavalry. Basically, the Getae face a mountain full of problems, and for every problem that you deal with, a new one is going to arise. And maybe that's me overestimating the issues that the Getae face, but it's remained true in the test campaigns that I've done, and I have heard that they are a fairly difficult faction from people on forums and whatnot talking about the Getae. So that's the general feel I get about them. They are a hard faction to play. As always, I recommend playing on normal difficulty so you can get at least some diplomacy happening before everyone goes into full-on total war mode. But if you really want a challenge, good luck playing them on hard, very hard, all of that. It's going to be a struggle, but you're going to have a lot of really tight fights, so good luck with that. Have fun, but I'm good. The Getae are a very interesting faction. Their roster is pretty unique. I like that. They all look fantastic, as do all of DEI's units, to be honest. There isn't a faction out there that doesn't look cool. However, yeah, you are just going to struggle with this campaign unless you're a very good Total War player or DEI player, in my opinion. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for our faction overview for the Getae. So let me know your thoughts down below. Do you find them as hard as I do? Do you have any tips for people who are considering playing as the Getae? Just give me your opinion. Did I miss anything that you feel like should be mentioned? I try to cover all the major aspects of each faction. However, there are some hidden things you can miss out on, and I honestly don't have time to play every faction in the game very thoroughly, but I instead use other resources to help me formulate opinions and give you guys as much information as I can to help you decide what to spend your precious and rare gaming time in. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.